Hola, buenas tardes. Si podrían pasar por favor a sus lugares para dar inicio a la siguiente sesión. Hola, buenas tardes. Si pudieran tomar asiento, por favor. Gracias. Antes de empezar, nada más quisiera confirmar si estamos listos con el equipo de YouTube para la salida a redes. Ya, entonces un minuto, por favor. Perfecto, me avisan que ya estamos en vivo. Así que continuamos con esta segunda sesión del seminario. Quisiera agradecerles a todos su presencia y a quienes nos acompañan por redes sociales. También agradecer que estén aquí con nosotros. Es un gusto tenerlos de vuelta en la CEPAL para celebrar este seminario fiscal. Y vamos a pasar a la sesión 2, que es una sesión que venimos desde hace años celebrando, para poder presentar los resultados de un informe que trabajamos en conjunto varias de las instituciones que estamos aquí presentes, junto con la OSD, CEPAL, el BID, el CIAT, y es las estadísticas tributarias de América Latina y el Caribe, que estamos en la 11ª edición de esta publicación, y que es un compendio amplio de las estadísticas tributarias para los países de la región, y no nada más con una actualización anual, sino con una base de datos homogénea que empieza desde 1990 y en esta edición llega hasta 2020. Entonces, para no atrasar más las cosas, lo que quisiera es presentar al panel que estará haciendo sus intervenciones. Primero participará Sebastián Nieto, quien es jefe para América Latina y el Caribe del Centro de Desarrollo de la OCDE. Posteriormente, Alexander Pick, quien ejerce en la Unidad de Datos Tributarios y Análisis Estadístico del Centro de Política y Administración Tributaria de la OCDE. Posteriormente, Michael Haney, quien es oficial de Asuntos Económicos de la División de Desarrollo Económico, hará una presentación de aquí de la CEPAL. Posteriormente, Francisco Weiner, quien es director de Operaciones y Gestión Institucional del CIAT. Y al final, Oscar Valencia, quien es especialista líder de la División de Gestión Fiscal del BID. Así que, sin más...
CIAT and Oscar Valencia, lead specialist, Fiscal Management Division of the IDB. And so Alexander goes first. Thank you.
Gracias. Muchas gracias, Noel.
Thank you, Noel, and good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure for us to return to Santiago after so many years that have changed in the last 3 years. But the initiative of tax statistics in Latin America and the Caribbean are strong as ever. This is thanks to the spirit of collaboration between ECLAC, CIAT, IDB, and the OECD. As Noel mentioned, we would like to thank all our partners for their support and work, and also especially thank ECLAC for hosting us today. The regional seminar on fiscal policy is today more relevant than ever before. So tax statistics in Latin America and the Caribbean, published in late April, is especially relevant because it shows in full detail and in a comparable manner the impact of the pandemic of COVID-19 in 26 countries of the region in 2020. Also, it shows how the pandemic has affected the trajectory of fiscal revenue since 1990, and so allowing a comparison with prior crises. And the report contains 2 special reports that will be discussed after this presentation. The first examines the income of non-renewable natural resources in the region in 2020-2021, whereas the second analyzes the monthly data on income during the pandemic. And so with this, we will be summing up the first chapter of the report on tax trends. The main finding of this chapter is that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on fiscal revenues in the region exceeded the impact on GDP, as we can see in the with orange dots in this graph. Fiscal revenues, 8.0% in nominal terms, more than nominal GDP in most countries. This led to a drop of 0.8 percentage points in tax revenues in the region in 2020 until 21.9% of GDP. These results should be interpreted carefully given the magnitude of the crisis. For example, Panama and St. Lucia recorded the greatest reductions in 2020, both of nominal GDP as well as nominal tax revenues, but in both cases, the reduction of tax revenues as a percentage of GDP was modest. Then the blue dots show the OECD countries, and GDP and fiscal revenue drops were far less than in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. And tax revenues of the OECD increased by 0.1 percentage points until 33.5% in 2020 within the OECD, and increased in 20 of the 38 countries. The next graph shows changes in tax revenues in the region from 2019 through 2020, and it dropped in 20 countries and increased in 6. In 5 countries, the reduction exceeded the 2 percentage points: Honduras, Bolivia, Belize, Cuba, and Trinidad and Tobago. In Antigua and Barbuda, Mexico, and El Salvador, fiscal policies were partly responsible for the rise in tax revenues. Antigua and Barbuda removed the extension of tax on corporate taxes and international corporations, which meant there was a rise in corporate tax rises in 2020. The rise in corporate tax increased in El Salvador as a result of a fiscal amnesty, whereas Mexico introduced several measures, including fiscal controls, addressing tax evasion and avoidance. White diamonds here show the performance of the region in 2019, a year that was difficult for some countries. Tax revenues increased by 0.3 percentage points that year, but dropped in 13 of the 26 countries. The next graph shows the impact of the pandemic on the various sub-regions, and in all three, the tax revenues came down by 0.8 percentage points, although each sub-region was affected in a different manner. The collapse of tourism has a particularly major impact on the Caribbean, whereas the sub-region of South America experienced a major drop in the price of non-renewable raw materials. This shows the trajectory of the average in the LAC region and the OECD average. In 2020, the gap widened between the two. We should point out that the drop in tax revenues of the OECD during the world financial crisis was much greater than the LAC average. In the case of the 2019 pandemic, the contrary occurred. And so with this, I hand over to Sebastian.
Y bueno, de nuevo, muchas gracias a...
Thank you. And once again, thank you, Noel Perez and Daniel Titelman. It's a great pleasure to be in this room commenting on our joint report on these aspects. With regards to taxation structure in the region, if we compare with OECD countries, we see that around 22% of the GDP was collected in Latin America. We're talking of more than 10 percentage points of difference with the OECD. In the OECD, the average was 33.5% of the GDP, with a high heterogeneity in the region. And what we see is that countries such as Cuba, Barbados, or Brazil collect more than 30% of the GDP, whilst in economies such as Panama, Paraguay, and Dominican Republic, and especially in Guatemala, they collect less than 15% of the GDP. And therefore, this high level of heterogeneity with regards to taxation structure leads us to various policy solutions at a country level. With regards to the impact of the COVID-19 crisis in the taxation structure in Latin America, what we find is that above all, it impacted by having a strong drop in taxes on added value and also on taxes linked to goods and services. That is where we find the biggest drop in most Latin American countries. But once again, there is heterogeneity, and in some countries, what we even evidenced is an increase. For example, in the case of Mexico, where we saw a positive impact during the COVID-19 crisis, and also in other countries such as Antigua and Barbuda. In general terms, and as mentioned by Alex, in 20 out of the 22 countries in Latin America, tax collection fell. And if we compare this with the average of OECD countries, what we find is that unlike the OECD, the impact, even when we talk of direct taxation, was practically zero, whilst in OECD countries, the impact was even positive during the COVID-19 crisis, as is the case of taxes on physical persons, and also with regards to social security contributions. Another aspect to be presented, and this was already mentioned beforehand, is the strong drop of VAT in Latin America. And if we look at OECD countries, that was much less. In global terms, what we found in Latin America was a drop of close to 0.8 percentage points. with regards to GDP in 2020 in Latin America, whilst in OECD countries, we evidenced an increase of 0.1 percentage points of the GDP. In absolute value, so the drop was close to 8% drop in nominal terms, as was already mentioned by Alex. And talking in greater detail, the taxation structure in Latin America, if we compare this in the long term, what we have seen is that we have advanced towards greater similarity to what we have in the taxation structure of the OECD countries. But the collection of direct taxes continues to be low in Latin America. We're talking of a ratio which is less than 27% of the total of collections, whilst in the OECD we're talking of a level of 35%. And to conclude, I would just like to insist that we analyzed certain specific taxes in Latin America. And here we would like to specifically insist on taxes linked to the environment. In Latin America, the level of collection is around 1% of the GDP, while in OECD countries, we are talking of practically twice as much, close to 2% of the GDP. And this is an issue that we can discuss later on. How it is necessary to collect more in environmental terms, but also generating the necessary compensations for the more vulnerable population. As key messages then in our report, and especially during the first component of the report, because our colleagues from ECLAC, from SIAT, and the IDB will comment on the rest of the report. During this first part, we would like to insist on three main messages. The first one is that in Latin America, we experienced a strong drop of tax collection with the COVID-19 crisis, around 0.8% of the GDP, whilst in OECD that increased by 0.1 in 20 out of the 22 countries in Latin America. The tax collection dropped with a collection of 21% of the GDP in 2020. And I previously mentioned that it was 33.5% of the GDP in OECD countries. If we analyze the taxation structure, we see that especially taxes on goods and services were the ones that dropped very significantly in the region. And when we talk of revenues as a result of income tax of physical persons and social security contributions, they remained relatively stable as a percentage of the GDP. Finally, and thinking about the type of fiscal reforms are necessary in Latin America in order to finance the recovery of from the COVID-19 crisis, and based on the analysis of the taxation structure in Latin America and also in comparison with OECD countries, we find that there is a margin in terms of improving taxes related to physical persons, and also looking at some taxes that can improve the progressive nature of these taxes, for example, property tax, and also rethink about some specific taxes such as the environment, where we can expand if and when we generate the necessary compensations for the more vulnerable populations, as has been discussed with other indirect taxes such as VAT in the case of Latin America. And with this, we would like to close the first part of the presentation, and now Michael will continue with the second part of the report. Thank you, Sebastian. I'll begin. No, it's unfair for me to be with you here. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and present to you the fiscal revenues that come from non-renewable natural resources. And before we begin, I would like to thank all colleagues present here, as well as the whole OECD team in Paris, in SIAT, and in the IDB, with whom we work every year in drafting this report, which is an important work that we conduct, important for us. As my colleagues have already mentioned, tax collection in the region dropped significantly in 2020. And in countries that produce renewable natural resources, this drop was aggravated by a reduction in oil and mining revenues. And as we well know, the shocks on demand and on supply at a global level had a strong impact upon commodity markets and likewise on prices. And the drop in these revenues in the region represented half or more of the total drop of public revenues, both taxation and non-taxation revenues. At least in some countries, this meant a very important shock. In the case of the region, the review of cases highlights three main factors. First of all, a shock on prices. That was a key aspect, as we will see. The reduction in oil production and mining production in countries, primarily as a result of public health measures such as quarantines and restrictions on the movement of people. And in some countries, there was a high comparison level because those countries obtained extraordinary revenues in 2019. In the case of fossil fuels, as we can see in the graph on the left-hand side, the drop is primarily due to a lower payment of royalties, which is the most important fiscal instrument that obtains most revenues in this sector. And in the case of royalties, as we see in the graph on the right-hand side, the drop was aligned with the reduction of oil prices. We're talking here of variations, interannual variations based on US dollars, so that this can be aligned with the price. So we're talking of around 34% in some countries. This drop was greater as a result of the reduction in production, despite the fact that in general terms, production did not really change so much for this group of countries because of an increase in Brazil that was quite important. And also production in Guyana that began in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. And therefore, if we exclude Guyana, the drop in terms of the drop of the percentage drop of the GDP, we will see that that drop is much more significant. I'll continue. In the case of mining, the situation is a little different because the main instrument, thank you, of collection is income tax.
Como vemos aquí, el impuesto sobre la renta y otros instrumentos.
And other instruments that reduce profits are very important. So the drop in 2020 was due to several factors, and not only relevant factors or for 2020. We have, for example, the effect of the lower profits received in 2019. So there were less payment for the regularization in 2020. The monthly pensions payments in the first half of the year were lower because of the effect of less sales and the drop in profits. And in some countries, we have the effect of tough relief measures, even though in general these measures had an effect, intertemporal effect within the same year. Only to highlight some special effects in the case of the plurinational state of Bolivia, there was a payment in advance for income tax in 2019 by very important company, mining corporation. And in Dominican Republic, we have the increase in the price of gold, which was key for the revenues in the country, and also an advanced payment of royalties from a large mining company. On the grounds of preliminary data, we can say that the revenue for non-renewable natural resources increased significantly in 2021, basically because of the price effect. Once again, the price of oil increased significantly, so it recovered its 2019 level. The price of copper, for example, increased significantly, and it reached a historic level. Iron ore, another very important product, also rose. So we consider that the oil revenues recovered in 2021. They are around 3 percentage points of the GDP. Something interesting only to highlight that it's almost the same value as the first years of the decade of the 2000s before the boom, and the mining revenues increased significantly. They were doubled in percentage terms of GDP, basically because of the good performance of income tax, because of the effect of price increases. Just to end, obviously, the current context, the Ukrainian war, is leading to an additional increase in the price of several products, specifically highlighting the price of oil. So we now see in the countries another very significant increase in these revenues. For example, in the first 5 months of the year, the price of oil rose again almost 70%. And in the first 4 months of the year, for example, in Mexico, we have an increase of 67% in oil revenues. And in Chile, we have something similar with a very significant increase in mining revenues. Just to mention that this database is available, the webpage of ECLAC, in our portal on statistics. The link is here. And you can find the figures here. Thank you very much, Michael, for giving me the floor. And specifically, I want to thank Daniel and Noel. Noel, I believe that the organization has been fantastic, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure for us to be here once again in this panel that has become historical. We've been here for more than 10 years, and fortunately, I've been able to be here before sharing with the colleagues of OECD and ECLAC, and even much better now with the comment with which Oscar will close from IDB. Just to express that in this important publication that is more than 10 years old, a joint publication between OECD, ECLAC, and CIAT. Obviously, a very important work has been done in terms of harmonization of data and databases for them to be comparable in terms of the data as have been presented by Sebastian, for example, on the OECD, with those of Latin America regarding GDP. In this publication, we have collaborated with Chapter 3, specifically dedicated to the evolution of tax collection And the countries that are members to see it, which basically are the Latin American and Caribbean countries, which is the focus of this meeting. So it's my pleasure to be able to share our data with you, which of course are very related to what has already been said, but we will be presenting data of tax collection in Latin America and the Caribbean related in country groupings, but related in comparison with the year that we call the normal year in the document, which is 2019, prior to the pandemic, which is this one we see here in the screen. Here we see, of course, that one of the groups here, it is separated by groups of countries that form this sample. It's not all member countries from SEA, not all the countries from Latin America and the Caribbean, but these are the countries of the sample. In methodological terms, this is very important to highlight. And thank you so much to all the countries who participate and share with us every day in the midst of all the tremendous work that the tax administrations have collaborating with these data that permit us to make these analyses and to compare and make these comparisons. Here we clearly see the drop in the second quarter 2020, we all know very well, and the tax collection, a tremendous impact because of confinement, lockdowns, a drop in production and consumption, because this is the total collection compared interannually with the tax collection 2019. So we have, in general, for the countries, for the orange curve that you can't see very well here, but you will see it very clearly in the publication that OECD is presenting today, that the orange curve represents the countries from Latin America and the Caribbean that reached levels of the lowest collection as compared to 2019, greater than 20% less collection. And in terms of accumulation of collection, that year, 2020, ended with minus 10.9%. A major impact, right? That graph is a bit more complicated because we have incorporated other subgroups from the region, such as the Andean countries, that dropped even further. And the countries from Central America and the Caribbean selected in this sample, which are also way below, and they reached the low curve of that trimester that we're talking about. Having said that about the groups of countries, and that everything that we will be presenting now is in comparative terms of 2019 collection and 2020 now complete year, as in comparison with 2019, we will also see it in terms of a type of taxes, which is interesting to make that analysis. And then even by monthly variations and accumulated variations for that group of countries. Here we start having two charts, one to the left, one to the right, which reflects the total accumulated collection, comparing complete 2020, the complete year, no, and 2021 is complete, to the left, in relation to the 2020 tax collection, which was where we saw the greatest effect of the pandemic. And at the right, we see the same comparison, 2021, but comparing it with 2019. That we said before that we were taking it not as a normal year, but as the year prior to the pandemic. There we see, as our colleagues from OECD said, that the specific taxes on consumption, which are in purple, lagged below even in the 2021 recovery, whilst fortunately income taxes on the Latin American countries and value VAT and services taxes did have or did continue with their recovery, relative recovery that was coming since 2020, and by 2021 they even surpassed by little in relative terms and accumulated terms as well that of 2019. We continue then with what I was telling you now in month per month, the evolution of the total tax collection 2021 in comparison with that of 2020, the pandemic, and 2019. And we see that, of course, obviously, if during 2021, there had been an increase or a recovery, slow recovery, but recovery nonetheless of the levels of tax collection from 2019. Obviously, the 2021 collection compared to 2020, which is the plot to the left, represents high yield, high performance. And conversely, if we compare the total accumulated collection of 2021 with 2019, the year prior to the pandemic, we see that in total accumulated, including the specific taxes on consumption, they did not recover as much and they remained below the level of collection. We still see a stability above the 2019 collection, which I hope that we will see comments from Oscar to see how they visualize the future. This is the same thing, the same scheme, the same prior analysis, but now the type of tax on a monthly basis, monthly collection, and the curve of the curve, even though it sounds redundant, of course, the columns are the collection for each month, and the curve represents the accumulated collection. And in income tax, we already said that there had been a significant recovery 2021 over 2020, as we can see at the left of the graph. And also as compared to 2019 in income tax. And income tax and VAT, which is the one that now continues, this is the evolution of the collection of the VAT 2021 compared to 2020. And there we see that there was a significant pickup, fortunately, in 2021, very related, and it's worth commenting, with the issue of the increase in mobility included in Chapter 3, but I'm certain that our colleagues from OECD have also included it. We have the relationship between the increase in the collection and the increase of the mobility of the persons.
We took data in terms of recreation and hospitality and restaurants data, and the data are highly correlated to the increased tax revenue. But that is for you to read in the report. We are not going to delve into this aspect because there are very difficult calculations. So here is also that added value tax, the recovery between 2020 and 2021, it's more between 2021 because the pandemic year, we know what kind of a curve we experienced in Latin America. Even the curve during the second quarter of minimum tax revenue, less than 20% compared to 2019, was also true because Latin America, in knowing what was coming from Europe in terms of tax management, we already knew some measures that tax revenue offices had adopted in Europe, for example, deferring tax payments and to offer payment plans to taxpayers. So that is also reflected in that drop during the second quarter. I'm going back to the first chart actually in my mind, but you can see it in the report that OECD will issue. Now, in summary, just in closing, here in 2021, we're already talking about 2021, both in terms of income tax as well as value-added tax allowed for total tax revenue of revenue services of each country, considering this study in 2021 accounted for an increase below 3 or 4 or 5%, which is significant, but on top of the 2019 base year for comparison. The same thing we discussed about the consumer selective tax, because they did not show that level of recovery. That very much coincides with the data that OECD published in terms that these taxes did not recover significantly, but in aggregate terms, I would say, I do not want to anticipate any comments, but are some hope in terms of increased tax revenue recovery. And I could not miss this opportunity to let you know about how happy we are at SIAT, of just like ICLAC, of going back to face-to-face events and meetings. And our next meeting will take place in Europe. We have member countries in Europe, Spain, as it's been said this morning. Also, SIAT has a very strong linkage, and they will offer the annual technical conference next October 4th to 6th. You're all kindly invited, and we hope to see you. Thank you very much. All yours.
Bueno, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you, Daniel, for the invitation. For us as IDB, is very important to discuss this scenario, not only to give you some comments about the Latin American statistical tax document, but also to show you the analysis that we as IDB have developed precisely in regards to the pandemic and the consequences that we see on taxes and on fiscal matters. So I'd like to start with something that Francisco said, the effort of revenue statistics in terms of harmonizing and building consensus in terms of tax statistics or revenue statistics. It's not only about collecting information, but the type of analysis that is done. In our previous presentation, we heard a very detailed analysis in terms of higher frequency. So there's mobility analysis in terms of in the bank. This has been key to be able to provide technical assistance, technical aid, and to better focus our operations. And from the point of view of the comments we have about, we are going to break it down into two. First, it relates to from the foresight point of view. So what we are thinking ahead is about fiscal aspects and then policies. We as a bank, we are looking at the main lines in terms of policy and revenue that could be considered. And that is what is part of the macroeconomic report that we publish on an annual basis. And this was launched back in March. And I will start by summarizing some of the findings. I drop at 0.8 percentage points, as I already mentioned. And in terms of the potential, there's also a drop. And that is important because the shock during the pandemic, it was a combined shock because it was supply shocks, but during the pandemic was also supplying demand shocks, and those demand and supply shocks also affect the taxable basis, and many other authorities have mentioned that already through different types of analysis. So we shared also that vision, and not only because of the direct effect on the value chain structures, but also because of the policy responses coming from different countries. When we developed the macroeconomic report, we see estimates for end of year, and we see the repercussions of the bottlenecks that could impact fiscal balances. In spite of these, supply shocks were amplified, and therefore they were more complicated because of the inflation effect and the monetary policies impacts on inflation. So what we see is three different scenarios. One, before the war, so to speak, where there were bottlenecks or inflations that may have not been that persistent. We're talking about December, and then later on, those scenarios where the war scales up and a policy standardization policy, which is tightening of the financing policies. That's important because anyhow, on emerging economies, especially in Latin America, this creates changes in terms of the GDP gaps, in terms of how they can also respond, how tax revenue can behave into the future, as we see here on this scenario. Normalization or conflict escalation, we expect a very slow return to pre-pandemic levels, but that is an effect in the heterogeneous regions. For example, in the case of commodities exporters, they will receive a significant inflow starting this year and part next year of tax revenues and non-tax revenues that could be around 2 points of the GDP. But there are other groups of countries in which, for example, those who rely on tourism for their economy, in which global conditions may directly impact their economies and therefore the tax revenue capacity. In terms of policy behavior, what do we see as the main restriction in terms of important tax revenues? We're going to talk about informality. In prior crises, informality was also used as a cushion, so to speak, to dampen the shocks. But during COVID, that didn't happen. Informals and inactive increased. Informals, not that much, but since the shock becomes a supply shock, not so much a demand shock, so informality starts creeping and increasing, and unemployment rates start becoming substantially high, especially in countries where it's above 2 digits, actually. And the response from the tax revenue point of view, we see in the macroeconomic report, there are 3 pillars. The first one is an analysis that has been done regarding the negative income tax that, according to the analysis that was presented, may consider significant gains in terms of formalization of the labor, the personalized VAT, which creates not only gains in terms of formalization, but also in terms of tax revenue improvement. And the third one, of course, which is implicit also in a tax management, digital tax management that allows to increase tax revenue efficiency. I'm going to give you some numbers, some figures. This is work from my colleagues at Carla Priscilio, Emilio Pineda, and Alejandro Razzeletti. So through microsimulations analysis, they show that for different countries in the region, implementing the negative income tax may reduce the informality tax even by 50%, which is significant. At the same time, the macroeconomic impact, according to estimates that we have done by implementing the negative income tax, the contrafactual one may not only reduce the informality, but also increasing the GDP and even 2 percentage points higher in the midterm. In terms of fiscal revenues, the experience in the region has been more based on reducing parafiscal or payroll taxes. But we are proposing in this case is more related to fostering the formalization through direct incentives on the supply in order to achieve significant gains in tax revenues. The second aspect is personalized VAT. There's been extensive research of Pineda and Barrelsi. They show that personalized VAT has something important to show, that it may operate or work in economies in which the redistribution degree is low. What does it mean? That Gini before and after taxes doesn't vary. And we believe and we see that in this type of situations, the distribution may be improved significantly and increase tax revenue, and additionally foster formalization of the labor. Now, in closing, all of this, as I said before, being part of a robust tax management, not only introducing digital tools that will make fiscal instruments more efficient, but also to consider a supplement to the human capital, which is key, of course, to make this effective. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Oscar.
Thank you, Oscar, Francisco, Marco, Alex, and Sebastian, for these very interesting presentations, and for one more year of collaboration of revenue statistics that we believe is going to be the case in the future. And now we are going to take a break, a 10-minute break for coffee, and we'll be back to session 3 in terms of the perspective of international organizations in this for inclusive recovery in the region. Thank you.
Hola, ¿podrían tomar asiento, por favor?
Please have a seat. Thank you.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to this session number 3 of the Fiscal Seminar, where we will be dealing with the prospects, the perspectives of the international organization vis-a-vis the challenges of the region. As you can see, we have several presenters with very interesting subjects, and we are lucky enough to have a wide-ranging representation of international entities, ECLAC, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the IDB, and also the Bank of International Payments. I would like to simply mention that this is a session that we have been organizing for several years, and we want to bring the perspective of various international entities about the fiscal challenges of the region. And lately, we have also added the monetary vision that is supplementary to the fiscal perspective and that we often forget during these dialogues. So we will now have the participation of Paolo Mauro, who is subdirector of the Department of Public Finances of the IMF, and subsequently Daniel Titelman, who is director of the Economic Development Division of ECLAC. After that, Santiago Herrera Aguilera, who is a senior economist of the World Bank. After that, Sebastián Nieto, who is the head for Latin America and the Caribbean of the Center for Development of the OECD. Oscar Valencia, leading specialist of the Division of Fiscal Management of the IDB. After that, Alexander Pick from OECD. And then Carlos Cantu from the Bank of International Payments. Paolo, if you're ready, we will begin with your presentation. Thank you very much. You have 15 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's really an honor and a pleasure to have this opportunity. And I have to admit that I really regret not having the opportunity to share a coffee with you, because those are the parts of seminars and conferences that are always the best. I'm going to start my presentation from something very specific, and then I'm going to zoom out to more general fiscal issues. I hope that you can see my presentation, and if something happens, please let me know. But I want to begin by refreshing our collective memory on what I believe is the most pressing and top of mind issue for citizens in the region, and not just in Latin America, but actually this is what is really concerning people all around the world, the very large increase in energy prices and food prices. And I want to just highlight a couple of features of the price developments that we have observed. The first is that we have already seen large commodity price spikes during the past 1.5 decades. So it's not really new, but there are a couple of features that are new. And in particular, what is even worse than in the previous two spikes is the very sharp increase in food prices. I want to concentrate on the period that follows Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Specifically, of course, we know that the increase in commodity prices predates that invasion, but there was a big spike both in oil and food prices. After the very big spike at the beginning of the war, oil prices have kind of hovered about at the same level, or perhaps a little bit lower. Of course, this could last longer than in previous episodes. We don't know. Natural gas prices have gone up even further since that invasion, and this is particularly of concern more for the European economies, perhaps. But food prices is where I want to focus, and that is where we really saw a near doubling of prices that was precipitated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that's understandable because, of course, wheat is one of the major products of that part of the world. So what is the policy advice that economists usually provide when commodity prices rise? Well, in countries that have strong social safety nets, and I would say this is probably many advanced economies, a few of the emerging markets, usually what we advise is to let market signals play their role. Usually we advise that international prices should pass through to domestic prices. At the same time, however, you want to provide support to those people who most need it. Now, this is all very well and good, but the political reality is that we've observed social unrest even prior to the pandemic. The political situation in many countries across the world is fragile. And so we need to be a little bit more creative, perhaps, in our approaches. I'm personally a big fan of providing discounts, lump sum discounts on energy bills, electricity lifelines, or a discounted price for the first so many units of cooking gas, for example. Those would be ideas that I think would be worth considering. For countries that have not so strong social safety nets, and that includes many countries in the region here. Here we have to be a little bit more creative and understanding. And we've seen during the pandemic a lot of creativity in expanding social safety nets, sometimes through digital means, maybe discounts on transportation or education fees and so on. Just being a little bit more tolerant of a more gradual pace of pass-through to the extent that the country can afford it. Above all, I think we should prioritize food security. So really making sure that everybody has access to staple foods at a decent price. And I'm personally willing to contemplate even direct distribution of staples from the government, if that's what it takes. So to me, as a matter of kind of human rights and ensuring social cohesion, food security is a priority. That said, the reality is that social unrest across the world, including in low-income countries, actually is precipitated as often by increases in fuel prices and energy prices more generally. So we have to be very sensitive to those types of issues.
Excuse me, Paolo, sorry for the interruption. Could you tell us which slide you're presenting right now? Because there was an issue with the presentation, and now we're going to be presenting directly from here.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I'm on the slide which in the PowerPoint is numbered number 6, and it says policy advice, the role of international cooperation. And please let me know when I should restart.
I think we're ready.
Okay, thank you very much.
And let us know, by saying next, and we can move the slide.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So, of course, there's a lot that the international community can do as well. And my personal belief is that we should be doing more. There are some ideas that are on this slide that may be familiar to you, of course, but avoiding export restrictions, trying to make sure that we don't overly push the idea of biofuels because those are a substitute for food. And so at the time of a food crisis around the world, that's something that we should be very careful about. Next slide, please. So now we move from what is the kind of normative advice to what countries are actually doing. And what countries are doing in practice is quite different from the theory of allowing complete pass-through, of course. In the advanced economies, just because financing is more easily available, we see much more support measures. We also see support measures in emerging and developing economies to a lesser extent. But what I want to emphasize is that the most common types of support are taking the form of either cuts in taxation or price controls, price caps on energy, or subsidies. And the unfortunate consequence of this is that collectively at the global level, what we're doing is we're failing to provide people with a signal that they should be conserving energy. We are not allowing the market to encourage people to move away from fossil fuels. And the consequence is also that we're essentially bidding up the price of fossil fuels globally. So particularly when you look at it from the perspective of low-income countries, what we're doing is we're making life more difficult for them because they don't have the ability to support their population, and they're still suffering from these high prices of fossil fuels. If you look at the the next slide on energy and food subsidies, this is actually quite expensive, as I'm sure you're well aware. There are a couple of examples from the region here. These are just the explicit subsidies that go in the budget, so I'm not even including implicit subsidies. And for Argentina, we're talking about more than 2% of GDP on energy subsidies. For a couple of other countries in the region, we're talking about 1% of GDP. Again, this is simply the explicit subsidies that are in the budget. Let's go to the next slide to look at the pass-through of international prices to the domestic prices. And what we see is that in calendar 2021, which would be the lighter color dots, the advanced economies were passing through essentially everything. Even in the Latin America and Caribbean region, there was a good degree of pass-through. But then from the beginning of 2022, when the situation has already become more difficult, the increases are more pronounced, you see that the degree of pass-through has declined substantially. And there's a lot of variation across countries, of course. But the bottom line is that it's becoming increasingly challenging for governments to sort of allow this pass-through. The solution, of course, ultimately, and here we're moving to the next slide, the solution would be to move to renewables. Unfortunately, that takes time. It's a matter of urgency, but it's something that does take a little bit longer. The good news for the Central and South America region is that the starting point is one where renewables, particularly hydro, is more prevalent, and there's a good degree of increase. But in no region is this enough to achieve the climate goals that the world has given itself as a benchmark. And so I think anything that can be done to accelerate that transition would be beneficial, both from a perspective of energy security and, of course, from the standpoint of climate change. So now let's move to the next slide, where we're going to look at the bigger picture. And here I'm looking at fiscal deficits as a whole, looking at the path for income for various groups of countries around the world. And as you will probably remember, we have a situation where the advanced economies in early 2020 gave massive fiscal support to their people and firms. And that was one of the factors that allowed them to have a GDP path, which you see as the red line here, that by 2023 on average is already back to the level that would have been predicted in pre-pandemic projections. And so the fact that the advanced economies were able to finance themselves, to finance that massive fiscal support, has helped them avoid a prolonged scarring in terms of GDP levels. The situation is different when one looks at emerging markets, and particularly when one looks at low-income countries. The situation for Latin America is pretty much on average that of the emerging market economies. That is one in which there was some support provided in 2020. That support was mostly unwound already in 2021, and we're kind of back to normal. But the implication is that there's been a step loss in output that will not be recovered going forward. So if one looks at the output versus pre-pandemic projections, the trend may have come back, but there's a step loss in the level of output. Now, when it comes to the implications for how one looks at fiscal policy going forward, it's also important to remember that in March 2020, we were in a situation where inflation was pretty low, especially in the advanced economies, but also in emerging markets, it was still relatively low. And many countries were at the effective lower bound for monetary policy. So in that context, it made sense to provide massive fiscal support because the objectives of monetary policy and fiscal policy were aligned. Unfortunately, for emerging markets already in 2021, and certainly now for advanced economies as well, we are in a situation that is completely different for fiscal policy, where now it's important for fiscal policy not to add fuel to the fire when it comes to fighting inflation. So, of course, the first point of defense against inflation is monetary policy, but fiscal policy has to play its role. And we can, of course, also think about the implications of that type of setting for monetary policies in the core countries of the global financial system and what that does to emerging markets as well. I'm going to just show very briefly the next slide on debt and deficits in Latin America and the Caribbean, just to remind us that we started out prior to the pandemic with an average public debt ratio of about 66% of GDP. And the pandemic, of course, gave a big boost to debt ratios in the region and around the world. They jumped to 77%. And gradually, in subsequent years, we project a stabilization of the debt ratio around 70. So in the grand scheme of things, public debts have not risen dramatically, but the context in which we operate has changed quite a bit. And again, we have higher inflation, we have more uncertainty, and so the question is, how do we reassure investors, be it domestic investors or foreign investors, about the future path of fiscal policies. Many countries in the region had, like others around the world, had to either invoke escape clauses or temporarily abandon their fiscal rules or fiscal frameworks. And now comes the question, what's next? And so I would say one of the priorities going forward is to figure out how do we go back to some fiscal anchor, some notion of a fiscal framework that can guide expectations for what fiscal policies will do in the future. I'm going to stop here, and I hope we have an opportunity for an exchange later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for this very interesting presentation and for showing the challenges, the fiscal challenges that the region needs to consider going forward. Ahora regresamos a.
We go back now to the room where Daniel Titelman, who is the director of the Division of Economic Development of ECLAC, will give us his presentation. Daniel, you have 15 minutes. Well, thank you so much. My presentation somehow collects part of the topics that have been analyzed during the morning session in terms of the challenges stemming from the debates, from hearing to the countries, and also from what Paolo was telling us about the importance and this strong clash that the Ukrainian invasion is leaving behind in terms of the impact upon food, inflation, and a very worrisome topic, which is food safety for a very important and growing part of the world and regional population. There's also an issue of food safety, which is generated not only for a problem of the supply of grains and wheat and cereal, but also because of the price dynamics, which is causing difficulty to a growing difficulty of access for many people, and this requires a response from fiscal policy that we see through what most of the countries are implementing, subsidies to food, or reduction of VAT, or some tax issue trying to alleviate the impact of the price of food on the most vulnerable population, and also the issue of food safety. But also, the current global situation, what it poses upon us among the fiscal challenges of the region, I would like to pick up some of the challenges that were being analyzed this morning and start to outline the challenges of fiscal policy around these challenges that by now one could consider to be more structural, such as the low dynamism and growth in Latin America. In this graph, what I would like to show you is fundamentally, you look from the 80s on, the orange bars are average so for 6 years, and the growth dynamic of the region, well, this has been reported before the 80s, but I would particularly like to emphasize on how, starting 2014, the region starts to go in a process of economic slowdown with an average growth rate of 0.3 between 2014 and 2019. Of course, we have the clash of the pandemic, -6.8, which is one of the worst contractions in the region observed at a worldwide level. We see a strong recovery, which is statistical rebound and recovery of the economic activity. But fundamentally, there's a statistical rebound. And for this year in ECLAC, we are projecting, our latest projection is an average growth of 1.8. So the message we get here is that the region is having a more structural problem of growth dynamics of a low growth plateau, which conditions, of course, fiscal policy, but fiscal policy also conditions part of the monetary policy in the macro context and makes it more difficult to make this growth more dynamic. So a first topic that was already mentioned strongly this morning, but it is not an issue of the current situation that the pandemic left, but it's rather more structural within the region. And there is a major challenge of how to make growth more dynamic whilst having the challenge of changing the pattern of growth. It has to be environmentally sustainable, socially inclusive, and that sets upon us a stronger challenge in a more complex macro environment given by the low growth and high inflation, which condition the response to monetary policy, which also makes it difficult to have a more dynamic economic growth. This graph shows you the forecast that we just issued a week ago. I will not stop at each country level, but really for the average of the region, in April, we were estimating 1.8, and probably if there is a trend, it will be a downward trend throughout the year, and we would be expecting growth according to the way that we see things, which is lower growth than this 1.8. I will not go country through country, but there are some countries that have growth. Colombia was saying, Venezuela, the countries that have been favored by because of the oil or food are having a stronger growth. But in general, the countries of the region, and particularly those who are importers of food and fuel, are having more complications than what they had before in their dynamism and growth with the pandemic, with the Ukrainian war. And not only have the problems of growth become deeper, but also the social problems and the social gaps that the region faced, which is also an important issue. Just to show you what many have already been telling us, that we are living through an inflation. The region as an average in April had an average of 8.2% inflation in terms of prices, where of course the inflation of food and energy prices play a central role. But there's also a trend of the underlying inflation, which has conditioned the response of many of our central banks in terms of the increases and the hikes. At the right, we show you the difference between the inflation of foods, which is the strongest, followed but the underlying inflation is strong, and also the inflation of the tradables, which is fundamental for the region. That's been important, and this deals with what we were talking about, the clashes of supply and demand that we're going through, which makes it difficult for monetary policy responses. Here, just to show you that the expectations of inflation continue to be high in spite of the hikes in interest rates. The expectations of inflation continue to be strong in spite of the signals of the central banks. Here, we just put the inflation targets for those countries who have an inflation target, the maximum tolerance, which is in the case of Brazil, 1.5 up. When they passed the inflation in the past 12 months. And as you can see, the goal is surpassed in practically each country, and the expectations of inflation continue to be higher, which is conditioning the response of many central banks, and continue with hikes of their rates, trying to anchor the expectations. And as we were discussing today in the morning on lunch, that isn't really working, and that the inflation expectations continue to rise as they include geopolitical clashes. There is a very interesting topic here, because our inflation model in general is not designed to analyze clashes of a geopolitical and warlike aspect that we're going through. If the war continues, the persistence of inflation and the dynamic of inflation will continue. And those are variables that are not included in our econometric models, and it is very hard to evaluate the persistence of these clashes. That generates a higher degree of uncertainty. This graph is just to show you the significant efforts made by the central banks in having rate hikes. And here we show you the rates as of February 2011, 21, as of May 2022, the accumulated variation, and the value of May 2022 compared to the value of February 2021, and the number of increases. And we can see that Chile, jointly with Peru, are the countries who have had more hikes in interest rates. Chile 16 times, almost 17 times, has increased its interest rate, passing from 0.5 to 9. Peru from 0.25 to 4.50, which is a hike of almost 18 times. So in general, the central banks have responded very forcefully, raising interest rates, which of course will have strong impact in the dynamic of growth that we said was one of the structural issues.
No, the public sector, not only interest rates are hiking, but also domestic interest rates are climbing. But as we heard this morning, many of our countries are able to issue locally denominated debt, but at increasing costs. That is an issue that actually affects or impacts our fiscal policy. Something else that we believe very much part of the fiscal policy and fiscal policy needs to cover is the employment slow recovery. Although it's been recovered compared to the significant drops that we saw during the pandemic in Latin America, of course, you may remember that the one mostly affected in terms of job losses compared to the rest of the world, the recover dynamic and job creation is way slower compared to the GDP recovery. This is a GDP recovery, which is in orange between 2019, 2020, 2021, and recovery of job creation. And what you can see here is that job creation is lagging behind compared to the growth dynamic. And that's going to be emphasized when we are in a deacceleration phase again compared to growth in last year. And there's going to be a significant demand on fiscal policy in terms of pro-employment policies. In this case, they're special because job losses and lack of dynamics in job creation are very much connected to those sectors that receive the highest impact during the pandemic: services, tourism, and hospitality. There's a significant lag there that will require a challenge for fiscal policy making. And in this macro complex context in which we have a slow growth, structurally speaking, we could mention that with inflation and labor market issues, the efforts that we heard that all countries in the region presented in terms of fighting the pandemic left us in a more complex fiscal situation compared to what we used to have before the pandemic. And here simply I'm showing how in 2020 the red line accounts for total expenditure. Blue is revenue. We see significant impacts between 2019 and 2020, which is for the average of the region, accounts for the effort that countries made, transferring from 21.4 to 24.6, whilst revenues dropped from 18.4 to 17.7 because of that contraction, and that led to a primary deficit around 4.2. And in 2019, the primary deficit was around 0.5 and an overall deficit of minus 6.9. In 2021, what we saw is a slight increase of revenues due to the economic reactivation and a slowing down of expenditure, although higher than in 2019, but it was slowed down because many of the programs, as we will show in terms of support to households and small and medium enterprises, support programs were withdrawn during 2021 on average in the region, and that led to a slight improvement in the deficit because it reached minus 1.7 and 4.2 in terms of the overall deficit. For this year, we foresee a drop in overall expenditure of 23.4 to 21.6, and a reduction in total revenues and public revenues of 19.2 to 18.3. And since the expenditure shrinkage compared to the loss of revenues, we are estimating a deficit of around primary 1% deficit, and an overall deficit around 3.3%. So a very complex fiscal situation in a complex macroeconomic context with several demand in the short and medium term on fiscal policy that we believe must be catered to. And that is, we believe, the major challenge in terms of how to address the challenge. And one of the issues that this seminar is focusing on significantly, how to think of a fiscal policy in a significantly difficult context, but that has to play a role not only in terms of stabilizing the cycle, but also to stabilize growth and to make progress to a sustainable and inclusive growth. And we believe that is key. I'm not going to dwell on the Caribbean, but of course, as we have said, the fiscal situation in the Caribbean is even more complex compared to the rest of LATAM. And we see here the deficit and the loss and the drop in expenditure, and the fiscal situation in the Caribbean is always much more affected when you consider the natural disasters that usually affect the economic activity and the expenditure demands in the Caribbean. The debt level, as we heard from Paolo, has been increased post-pandemic, and between 2019 and 2020, it went from 45.3 for central governments and regions to 56.5, and in 2021 it was reduced to 53.7%. So together with a higher deficit, we have higher debt levels that become even more complex because of increased interest rates, both internationally and domestically, in financing, both in terms of foreign currency as well as in domestic currency. On the right, you can see the dispersion that has already been seen in this discussion at the country level, where there are countries with close to 80% of their GDP in terms of public debt, up to countries to close to 30% of debt to GDP ratio, like Paraguay. That is an important situation in the region that sets different conditions and different dynamics to the countries in the region. The average for last year around 53.7%. Once again, the situation in the Caribbean is much more complex in terms of debt compared to the rest of the region, where 6 countries have a country above 100% of their GDP, and that is a significant in the Caribbean. And we at ICLAC have issued a proposal, which is the exchange of debt for green growth, which is a green swap or debt swap, in order to build a resilience fund that will fund or finance investment based on climate change, adaptability, and resilience based on reducing the Caribbean debt. This is an initiative that ICLAC has been supporting beyond the restrictions and the debt that it means for the English-speaking Caribbean countries. Now, in terms of the hikes of revenues in 2021 will not be the same case in 2022 and let alone in 2023, behind the increase we saw in 2021, where we went from 14.6 on average for the region to 15.8 in terms of tax revenues. That is the rebound in terms of economic activity. Remember, the region had a significant rebound, reaching 6.3 after a contraction of 6.8% in 2020. And that created an important impact on tax revenue, and the withdrawal of tax relief measures. It had a positive impact in 2020 on tax revenues last year. We do not think that the situation will be repeated this year, as we heard from revenue statistics in the previous session. And also there's a significant challenge in that regard. Public expenditure was reduced last year due to the withdrawal of transfers in order to face the emergency. And as you see on the right, I'm sorry, I'm not covering the numbers, but you have the presentation, and because of time constraints, I'm running the risk of being stopped. So you see the resources that were mainly focused on defending household income, and also to some extent production to productive activities, especially in terms of healthcare, and also to protect households' income. Now, the macroeconomic context makes sustainability more difficult through different mechanisms. On the one hand, there is a deceleration of growth, which will weaken tax revenue. And one of the elements that we've been discussing is how to expand the fiscal space through increasing public revenue. A second one has to do with financing costs due to interest rates increases, both internationally and domestically. That will affect the dynamics of fiscal sustainability. The reduction in credit ratings, the sovereign credit ratings, play a significant role in risk rating agencies. They keep this pro-cyclic policy they've always used, which creates a non-trivial problem in our countries, in which they may end up conditioning fiscal policy in our countries that can usually be thought as how to avoid the loss of risk rating through improving deficit in order to avoid these high costs. And this is a very complex issue because there's a negative incentive
para riesgo hacia la política fiscal.
to fiscal policy. And of course, inflation hikes that will generate more pressures on public expenditure, subsidies to fuels, subsidies to food baskets, and also increases in terms of tax revenues, especially in terms of exemptions for energy consumption and the production of food products. We have a complex macro context that makes fiscal sustainability difficult, and we have several demands on fiscal policy. Therefore, it is a complex situation. What is our proposal? That the region will require a fiscal policy, an active one, and therefore the question is how to go in that direction. And here we have tried to define 2 or 3 areas that we believe are important. One of them is increasing fiscal sustainability, relies on strengthening tax revenue. Several countries are discussing tax reforms in the country, but there's a significant medium-term discussions, which is a fiscal and social compact in the region, to try to address these issues. Public spending, we believe, has a significant challenge to face, and we try to define it has to strategically oriented to have a strategic view of public spending, which means how to reconcile the short and long-term challenges of social demands and expenditure demands with a more medium to long-term view of that spending, so that it can contribute through investment and through the strengthening of social protection systems, and also with an impact on growth dynamics and strategies. Something else that we will try to cover, and I'm closing with this, is it's been mentioned, and it's going to be tomorrow's session, how we are going to require a change in the fiscal policy institutional arrangement, not only fiscal rules, but also the criteria that we use to allocate spending, so that it can not only contribute to the macroeconomic stability, but also to protect social spending and public investment that we believe is key. And finally, let me insist that although the conditions are quite complex, it is not the time for premature fiscal adjustments in the region, given the challenge of actually making the economic situation in the region more dynamic and the social demands and the space to expand the fiscal space in the short term. We believe tax evasion is something that the country should be focusing on. According to our calculations, on average, evasion is around 6.1% of the GDP, which accounts for almost $325 billion. Just to give you a number, I may use Chile as an example. When you look at the different tax reforms that have happened in the last decades, between 1 to 3 GDP points are collected in terms of evasion. We could be collecting significant resources. We're able to actually be moderate in avoiding tax evasion and avoidance. So because that is going to increase and improve tax revenues. Revising tax expenditure on average is close to 3% of GDP, but there are countries that may be around 5% of the GDP in terms of tax spending. We believe they may have a positive impact if they are well designed, and also increasing fiscal revenue significantly. They reach on average 17% of budget expenditure of central government, which is not trivial. To adapt tax codes to new BEPS practices and to see what we can obtain from what's going on globally. That is also a direction in the short term. In the medium term, how to consolidate income revenue or income tax, especially for individuals. In 2020 reached 2% of the GDP, whereas in OECD reached close to 8% of GDP. And as we heard this morning, this has to do with how to emphasize on higher income and not to lean on the most vulnerable sectors of the economy, which is a major challenge, because it means that we need to start thinking again about wealth taxes, capital taxes, etc., to extend the scope of capital equity taxes, and I'm going to cover especially in terms of what we are experiencing in the increase of raw materials, which means that our governments must be much more flexible and active so that they can actually receive these profits because of this impact on oil and foodstuffs and minerals in many cases. And finally, green taxes, as Sebastian said, in the case of OECD, they are around 2% of in Latin America, so there's a lot to be done. What we want to say is that we have a short-term agenda and longer-term agenda that the countries need to balance in order to try to make progress in terms of creating revenues that will sustain a larger expenditure.
And now allow me just two things more. Income or revenue coming from non-renewable natural resources could be very relevant in many countries. In Ecuador, almost 20%. In Trinidad and Tobago, 18%, Bolivia, 18% also, and in some other countries between 6 and 7% of total revenues. In general, countries use royalties on values or the taxes on profits and do not capture the upside. And so there's a discussion on how to begin using taxes on extraordinary profits, which is essential to modernize our tax frameworks in the countries of the region, especially relevant to those countries that have major revenues coming from non-renewable natural resources. The challenge of increasing investment, I merely wanted to say this continues to be a core of core relevance if we want inclusive and green growth. And in this graph, we see that Latin America is the region with least investment globally, 19.7 in comparison to 32.7 and in the emerging markets. And there is a major challenge there on how to increase investment, and public policy and fiscal spending and public investment have a lot to say in this area. And on the right, we're showing the trends in capital expenditure and the trends in interest payments that will continue up given the dynamics of interest rates in the region. There too, there is a major challenge on how to adapt to ensure that the fiscal policy begins to meet its demands. And with this, we end. Here, I simply wanted to show how aging of the population and the epidemiological transition will imply a demand for fiscal spending very, very high. Here, we simply show the aged population dependence rates 15 to 64 over the level of spending and pensions. And you can see, as to be expected, the very high trend of the positive curve upward, and Uruguay is one of the countries that spends most, one of the most aged populations in the region. But this is something that we believe is very relevant. Now, the social gaps that the region already has, aging and the epidemiological transition will become a demand for spending, very high, far beyond the demand of the current conjuncture, and fiscal policy will have to address this, as it will also have to address the issue of investment. And to conclude, something that has already been said regarding the challenges imposed by climate change for fiscal policy. I think that everything that we could say is little, and simply let me show you some exercises that we did for the 6 exporting countries of oil in the region. That if they had to move towards 2015, what we call the net zero emissions, which would be a zero emission scenario, stop producing hydrocarbons. If you take a look at the blue line in each one of these graphs, this is the projection of what we call the loss of tax revenues via the oil exploitation, plus a spending trend close to the percentile 2022 of the OECD in terms of social expenditure and investment. And you can see that almost all countries, the debt trend is unsustainable. And so this is indicating that if we're going to address the challenges of climate change, and the fiscal policy will have something to say about that, we must make very relevant adjustments to the institutionality and the dynamics of fiscal revenues. Otherwise, this trajectory is unsustainable if the fiscal policy takes seriously the challenge of investment required by addressing climate change, and especially via investments in changing the energy matrix and adapting the productive matrix. So this is also a warning regarding the major challenges in the short term that will affect the fiscal policy in its trend. And so to close, essentially, the message that we're trying to convey here is that quite aside from the macro difficulties of the conjuncture left by the pandemic and the war, there are clashes, but these are specific and special blows. The pandemic, one every 100 years. I don't know if the frequency should increase. Let's hope not. And the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is also something that we do not see every day. But together with that they are creating many difficulties. We have other issues that are more structural and that have to do with climate change, the progress of social demands in the region, with an increasingly aged population, and the fiscal policy will have to address that. And we're no longer in a political economy where before the fiscal policy could take second place and expect that the growth would resolve all difficulties which we have already learned will not happen. And that's why we believe that the issue of tax structures, the issue of tax revenues, and a strategic approach to expenditure is the way that governments and countries will have to begin constructing this new logic with regard to fiscal policy. That is what the message I wanted to share with you regarding the fiscal outlook. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for this very relevant presentation. And as you said, the fiscal outlook, everyone has a copy, and there we analyze all of these topics and several of those that we'll be talking about tomorrow in future sessions. So now we continue with this session, and now Santiago Herrera Gailera will take the floor, Senior Economist at the World Bank. The floor is yours.
Buenas tardes.
Good evening. My name is Santiago Herrera. I'm a World Bank economist, and I thank ECLAC for inviting me to the bank to talk about these very relevant topics. I will now begin because there's a lot of material. I will be going through my slides very quickly because these are topics that other speakers have spoken about during the day. And so the presentation has three parts to it. One on the initial conditions in 2022, the second on policy challenges, and the last one, key messages. Here, what we see is the Latin America context in the world, with real gross domestic product historically, which has been one of the lowest in the world. And here, this is taking as basis the pre-pandemic level in 2019, equal to 100, and Latin America is the slowest recovery. Now in 22, 23, Europe is falling below Latin America, but that is quite atypical. And the reason for that is well known. Now, this is in the region. There are some countries that have already recovered and exceeded pre-pandemic levels. This is a cumulative spending in 2019 through 2022. And what I would like to highlight is the group of countries at the bottom, almost all in the Caribbean. And that is because these are highly volatile economies, not very diversified and specializing in services and specifically tourism. And the other reason that explains this delay in the recovery is that these are countries that import energy and food. Now, this is employment almost recovered to pre-pandemic levels. And what I would like to highlight is the growth in informality in terms of employment. There's another companion slide here, but the scissors cut out that slide, which had to do with the rise in output by small and micro enterprises. From the medium to large companies, it's moving to the micro and small. And the consequence of this growth in informality and this change in production with micro enterprises has a long-term impact on the productivity. And this is important because the relevance of the fiscal policy in the short term must move towards stabilization without forgetting that there is a very long term and that a policy must face, and Oscar Valencia already presented very concrete proposals regarding the return to formality and the relevance for fiscal collections. Now, here we're moving on to the policy challenge. We're showing the price of commodities and their variance, and the Ukraine war has simply sharpened processes that were already at play, and that is the price of commodities that started to rise since 2021, as did the variance. And here we're getting into the regional level, the increase in the price of food, and that there it says transport, but our price baskets, it is the component of that basket that best shows the impact of the price of fuel. Now, the relevant thing here is that this morning there was a lot of talk about relative prices and changes in relative prices, but it is relevant to be aware that all other prices are also increasing. So just how widespread is the price change becoming in considering the origin of the problem, but when it becomes a widespread issue, the monetary policy must be active and controlling it. Here, what I would like to show, Daniel Titelman already spoke of the risk of food security. That has a social impact, which is long-term. So what we should consider is quite aside from the stabilization policy and start thinking of this risk. Surveys that we do of households show that households with underage children and the elderly are the most affected. And this is relevant because the social dimension of the issue of inflation, we cannot forget it, because inflation leads to discontent. Social discontent leads to reduced governance, and without appropriate governance, there cannot be stabilization, so therefore inflation continues. It is a vicious circle that we must somehow break. A few years ago, I saw propaganda by the Central Bank of Jamaica on creativity, on how to communicate to citizens the relevance of adjusting against inflation. It really fascinated me how creative the central bank was in doing this with very catchy music and some of the famous actors and actresses. But this is the way of engaging the population in the adjustment. Inflation expectations. These are very relevant to the process for the formation of wages and prices. Here we have the inflation expectations for late 2022 and late 2023 and also 2025. And this is obtained from Consensus Economics, but some central banks in the region have surveys, and the figures are very, very similar, not to say identical to the ones we're publishing here. The advantage of using this is that the sample is larger because there are some countries that do not have the inflation expectation surveys.
Hay cosas buenas y cosas malas.
This graph shows is that there are good and bad things. So the good thing is that they decrease over time. In other words, expected inflation for 2022 is greater than for 2023 and for 2025. All inflation in countries which have inflation targets, in all cases, we have gone beyond inflation in 2022, and for 2023, they are at the top limit. And these are the good things, that this is something that decreases over time. The bad thing is that inflation is sensitive to inflation surprises. In other words, they are not, inflation is not adequately anchored in practically all countries. There is still a risk. No, I would say that this is what is a fundamental risk is that the Federal Reserve is increasing rates, and there is a risk of high inflation, a risk of recession that increases over time in the US. The decade of the 70s and 80s share that in the sense that the Federal Reserve increases interest rates and there is a recession in the US, and therefore we must be very aware of that risk, and that imposes greater pressure on central banks that in addition have to increase the rates in order to control inflation expectations. In fiscal terms, I don't want to dwell on this, but the debt in Latin America is higher than in the rest of the world. Fiscal deficits originated in 2020 were still the highest in the world, and the deficit that is forecasted for 2022 for this year, the red line, represented in the red line, is practically the highest in the world. Now, in terms of the region, the debt will continue to increase. What we have illustrated here is a difference between the deficit that would stabilize the debt and the observed deficit. That gives us a clear indication that what we need is an effort to establish a fiscal consolidation in some countries more than in others. And in consequence, we have to rethink the issue of fiscal rules. This morning, there was a debate around the discretionality that is needed with the rigidity imposed by rules. But if we use indicators such as the adjusted balance in terms of economic cycle, we begin to introduce greater flexibility to the use of fiscal rules. But there is a session devoted specifically to this issue. The deficit structurally adjusted or cyclically adjusted is a useful indicator for countries that are very volatile and subject to natural risks. And what this graph shows is the evolution of the structural balance adjusted per economic cycle between 2020 and 2022. And what it shows is that there was a consolidation, a strong consolidation in 2021, following the maladjustment in 2020. But in 2022, the fiscal impetus, the difference between the structural balance of 2021 and 2022, well, that difference has slowed down. It has become, the fiscal adjustment has become much slower. That may be good or not, depending on whether we look upon this as a pro-cyclical fiscal policy. The peak of growth following the pandemic was in 2021 during the third quarter. That was the peak of the recovery for most countries in the region. And as from then, growth has decreased. And so part of the reason why the fiscal adjustment is slower is the result of the rigidity of the budget. There are budget components that are impossible to change in the short run. In the bank, we built rigidity indicators for the budget for 180 countries over time. And without dwelling on the details of that, on how we built that rigidity indicator, what we found is that the biggest rigidity of the budget is associated to a greater level of expenditure on the one hand, and that is on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you can see the rigidity of the budget with the taxation rates of aggregate value, and you can see a very close correlation. We also found that the countries that have greater rigidity in their budget, well, it is probable for them to suffer from fiscal maladjustments. And for countries that suffer from a fiscal maladjustment, those that have greater rigidity, is far more difficult for them to begin a consolidation process. Here, I would like to highlight, and what we could say is that the countries with greater rigidity have greater public debt. That is the graph on the left. On the right, we find an indicator of efficiency of public expenditure that the IDB brought out in a work by Roberto Suárez many years ago, and our efficiency indicator. Well, those are the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. What is clear there is the association between the greater inefficiency, the greater efficiency, and the greater the rigidity. The greater the rigidity, the less, the greater the inefficiency. We have also discussed this morning, and here I would simply like to summarize several of the points that were highlighted here. This same graph appeared in the presentation delivered by the Minister of Paraguay, but it is the first one that appears when we know that we have to consolidate in Latin America, and therefore what we have to do is to reduce inefficiencies. That, in accordance with the results that come from a paper of the IDB produced by Izquierdo, Vecino, and Bulletin. In the region, on average, there's around 4 percentage points of the GDP that can be recovered if we were able to reduce inefficiency. Here, you see some of the subsidies of fuels, which on average provide around 3% in the region. That is the graph on the right-hand side, and I am emphasizing here fuel consumption subsidies, because the vulnerability to climate change is something that we have to deal with in the region. There are other taxes, and unfortunately I don't have graphs for that, but I am referring to taxes that have positive externalities, such as taxes levied on the consumption of sweet beverages or tobacco consumption. And therefore, when one adds a reduction in inefficiency, a reduction in subsidies, taxes with positive externalities, one is able to find resources, but it's not easy, unfortunately. The work of Ministries of Finance and those that conduct or that design fiscal policies is not an easy job. What this graph shows is the two dimensions of fiscal vulnerability and vulnerability to climate change. And then you can see the countries in the region. Fiscal vulnerability is, we have constructed that indicator based on 25 different variables that define the fiscal space. This is a work conducted by COES at the World Bank, and we obtained a measurement of those 25 countries with an econometric measure. The other, the vulnerability to climate change is the Notre Dame indicator of the Global Adaptation Index. And what is important here is the quantification, and I would like to focus on the Global Adaptation Index to climate vulnerability, because if you establish a relationship between that indicator and risk, the risk perception of risk perception measured as the ranking of risk ranking agencies. I don't have that graph, but it is a graph that you can find. What is truly interesting is to view those rankings and how they are related to the indicator of climate vulnerability. These are two dimensions that we have to take into consideration, and policymakers have to be aware of the importance of their fiscal policies, taking into consideration climate vulnerability. I would like to very briefly summarize growth and a reduction in growth and an increase of inflation will be with us for a long time. The social impact is something that we have to bear in mind, and therefore we have to act promptly, emphasizing transfers that are temporary or one-time payments in order to prevent an increase of the budget's rigidity, which involves costs that we have already analyzed. There is also a risk. Well, not so much a risk. The risk is for Latin America in terms of an increase of interest rates that is occurring, and undoubtedly they will continue to increase as a result of inflation in the US and the risk of recession in that economy, which is increasing over time. And in consequence, our countries have to reduce their demand for financing, and especially external financing, despite the fact that the World Bank is poised to help in whatever it can. And finally, it is the social dimension and the risk of social discontent. That is something that we must take into consideration. And therefore, one of the measures, if we're going to reduce, well, I am not suggesting that we eliminate energy subsidies immediately or fuel subsidies, but that can begin to happen before. What can happen before we eliminate subsidies is a transfer, so that the public be more receptive to whenever the reduction of the transfer takes place over time. And the reforms of fiscal institutions have to improve. I want to emphasize transparency and the responsibility of public officials. That goes beyond a reform of fiscal institutions. That has to be accompanied with reforms in the judiciary and in the political system, which is the Achilles heel of growth in Latin America. Thank you very much. Thank you, Santiago, for this very important presentation. And since we're running out of time, we will move ahead with the other presenters. Sebastián Nieto. Thank you. Sebastián Nieto is the head for Latin America and the Caribbean at the Development Center of the OECD. Thank you, Noel. Let's say that the presentation that I'll share with you is very much aligned with what has been previously shared here and what the messages shared with us by Daniel Titelman and also by the colleagues from the World Bank and from the IMF. With other slides, I would like to reinforce some of the points that have already been mentioned. The starting point that I would like to comment with you has to do with the limited fiscal space that we have in Latin America.
And with the aim of complementing what was already mentioned before, the increase of the public debt over GDP. I would like to also mention what the evolution of the public debt has been, not only regarding GDP, but also regarding the taxes, which allows us to see what's the capacity that the governments have at the end of the day in order to pay the public debt. And what we see is that this ratio has increased close to 200 percentage points in the past 7 years. And particularly what we find is that in Latin America, the ratio of debt over taxes surpasses in 400%, which is a figure higher than what we have in the average of OECD. And once again, we have a high discrepancy amongst countries, considering countries such as Panama, Brazil, or Argentina, where it's surpassed by 500%, while in economies such as Chile or Paraguay have average that's the lowest in the region. So in this limited fiscal space in which we are in Latin America, I would like to insist precisely on the different components of the sustainability of the debt, particularly the risks that this entails. Starting by the economic growth, well, Daniel already mentioned it, we have low economic growth in Latin America, and particularly if we see the potential growth and the way that it has evolved in the region. Today, we have potential growth, which is close to 2.4%, very much less than we have the potential growth of the world economy. If we see the world economy under the same methodology that we estimate for Latin America, we're talking about 1 percentage point greater than what we have in the region. And as had already been noted before, increases in the interest rates due to the increase of the inflation rates, which are higher than the upper limit of the target inflation of several countries of Latin America, which leads to the relationship between economic growth and interest rates may lead to a risk of sustainability of the debt in Latin America. I would also like to mention the effect of the high inflation rates of the social vulnerability and thus the importance of controlling that inflation rate. Santiago already mentioned it. And in the case of several countries of Latin America, specifically Colombia, Costa Rica, we have seen that the inflation rate of the poor is close to 5 percentage points of the average that we have, the total inflation rate. So that's one of the analyses that we're working at for our coming report on the economic perspectives of Latin America, known as LEO, that we do with CAB, ECLAC, and the European Commission. Another element going back to the sustainability of the debt deals with the interest rates at an international level, the way that they've been growing. And given the recent expectations of inflation following the hikes in several developed countries, well, the perspectives are not encouraging in terms of the cost of the foreign debt for the countries of Latin America. Going on the sources of revenue, what we see is the high volatility of the raw material prices. What's a good news is the increase we have seen in the price of raw material for the net exporters. Yet, as we know, there's a variability in the region, and what's good news for South America and Mexico is not good news for the countries of the Central America and the Caribbean. So there is an additional risk as to the sustainability of public debt for these countries of Central America and the Caribbean. For the moment, and thanks to the high liquidity that we've had during the crisis of COVID and the entry of capital inflows during the crisis or the war in Ukraine, the spread of the sovereign bonds has remained at low levels. Yet, as we mentioned in this slide, this is something we've seen for the moment, but the risk, of course, given the high vulnerability on the side of sustainability of the public debt, there may be an increase of the spreads added to the drop in the classification or the rating of some countries of the region. Likewise, the high international liquidity, which is something different from what we have had in the prior international crisis, the crisis of COVID-19 with high international liquidity, and particularly recently, there's been an appreciation of the exchange rates, but the volatility is present, and this can also have effects on the sustainability of the public debt. Now, going precisely on, not to fall on the temptation of austerity and to see how we can fund and recover the economies of Latin America and the main investment drivers on the side of public investment, we have seen that it's quite low with an important bias of current spending versus capital spending. In Latin America, close to 80% of expend is on current spending, and is particularly trying to see what type of financing of the green and digital investment can finance a sustainable recovery in time in Latin America. Another element that I would like to mention is the need to search for other sources of funding, not only on the side of public investment, given the fiscal restrictions that we have in the region. So an important field is FDI, and for that, insisting on the need that it be direct foreign investment that would stimulate the creation of employment and productivity, which isn't always the case, given what we see in these two graphs. If we take into account an indicator that we have as the quality of FDI in Latin America, we see that even though this has positive effects insofar as labor productivity as regards domestic investment that we see in the first graph, when we talk about the contributions it has on the stimulating the competencies of the workers, that evidence does not benefit necessarily the FDI. So we have to see what we're investing in, what for, how we do it, and in what way we can create formal employment in the region. Going precisely into social spending. Something we saw throughout the pandemic was a rapid response to the vulnerable persons that were not covered by social protection. In the case of the emergency subsidies we had in Chile or Argentina, also solidarity income in Colombia, another in Peru, just to mention some of the programs. And now the point is, how do we rethink these programs for social assistance? Dismantling them is not the solution, particularly given the strong social unrest and vulnerability of the middle class, but at least we must rethink of them, creating a stimuli for formalization. One of them is thanks to the conditionalities that we may have in integrating mechanisms of development of competencies or performance in education, also better coordination among the different programs, and finally, including some clauses, some lessons learned, such as the crisis of COVID-19, with exogenous clashes that we should know how to foresee and to take into account in these mechanisms of social assistance. To highlight the importance of these mechanisms, what we had in the pandemic is that 40% of the workers were not covered by any social protection or social assistance program. So the idea is not to eliminate the programs implemented during the pandemic, but to rethink them for the recovery. That's one of the messages that we have on the side of spending, and considering above all the community of household analysis. In analysis that we're doing about informality in Latin America, we found that close to 45% of the households in Latin America are totally informal, for which then the policy solutions would be totally different if we speak of informal households from the mixed households, that is, that they have informal and formal workers within the household, or those that are totally formal. This also has an important point and are those who are dependent and the young persons or elderly persons who also need some sort of assistance and conditionality to improve their competencies or the quality of life. So this is to take into account the importance of targeted policies insofar as social assistance in Latin America for recovery. About the revenues, very rapidly in line with what we commented before, in Latin America, when we speak about tax revenues over GDP, close to 22% is what's collected in Latin America. In OECD, we're talking about more than 33% of GDP. That is that we have more than 10 percentage points of collection in the OECD as compared to Latin America, yet there is no single solution with the high heterogeneity in the region. The most important thing is to rethink the tax structure. Daniel mentioned it, close to 2% of GDP of collection to physical persons in Latin America, the countries of OECD, we're talking of close to 8% of GDP. So no doubt that greater progressivity to the taxes to physical persons is important. Also rethinking mechanisms against evasion, not only at a national level, but at an international level as well, and how we stimulate new taxes such as tax on wealth, for which it is important to have better statistical information, better tax administration, and some taxes where the collection continues to be low in Latin America, such as the taxes on property. Another important element on the side of taxes is tax exemption and tax expenditures. Here to say that when we talk about physical persons, it's not only, it's also the companies, the enterprises. We see that there are taxes where the rate can be high, but once they include tax exemptions, or they may even disappear, such as the case of Dominican Republic. For the case of the textile industry, was strongly reduced, as is the case in some countries when we talk about some specific taxes for companies. Here we have the case of Dominican Republic and Ecuador. The idea is to continue to expand this type of analysis that we're doing with a colleague from IDB, for which no doubt we get more information about what type of tax exemptions we have in Latin America and how it is possible to improve or eliminate some of these tax exemptions that affect value added and the creation of jobs in the region. As to environmental tax, and a more general reflections is the importance of having this type of tax, but knowing how to compensate or how to generate mechanisms of compensation to the most vulnerable populations. That is, supporting populations that may be affected by this type of tax. There are examples such as the case of Lima that can be taxes related to the environment. A topic that's important not only given the social unrest we have in Latin America, but also given the importance in searching for inclusive and sustainable growth. So it isn't just about applying this type of taxes in a generalized way, but to know how to target the mechanisms of compensation. Now, to close, I would like to mention the issue of the green agenda. The increases we have had of emissions or issuance of green bonds in Latin America. Here we have in mind the cases of Chile, Brazil, and Mexico. Yet a main challenge continues to be the bond issuance, sovereign green bond issuance, such as the case of Chile or Colombia. Recently, also at a subnational level, we can have Argentina or Mexico. Yet, in a general way, the idea of continuing to stimulate that type of mechanism to stimulate green growth. But this also goes in line with the green taxonomy, which is important to continue to stimulate at an international level, where the different creditors may also have benefits with these investments, even though they may not be issuing or they may not be emitting CO2 in the countries who are issuers of these bonds in Latin America. So it is an important agenda to stimulate purchases in international markets of these green bonds. Now, in order to close, I would like to insist then an important message, which is we need to have a response mechanism that's totally comprehensive, considering, as I said before, good management of the public agenda, also considering a good management of public expenditures, stimulating spending well targeted in sectors that might generate formal employment, and also to rethink some systems of social assistance with which it may be possible to support the most vulnerable population, and without any doubt, generating spending efficiency. On the side of the taxes, there are some alternatives: anti-evasion policies, improve the progressiveness of the taxes and stimulate some taxes such as property or wealth, and particularly to see what way do we rethink some of tax exemptions.
For all that, the sequence of actions and the policies, what we can do now and we can do later, or what we can be thinking of more in the long term, how to build a consensus, to build effective communication is also something that we have seen in the lessons from some Latin American countries, how to communicate ex ante and also to open up an inclusive dialogue with different stakeholders is key, and international coordination as well is key in these regards of political economics. So when we talk about communications, is the tax agenda driven by OECD, thinking of digital economy, but also minimum tax on multinationals. Also, when we talk about international coordination, is linked with the public debt and how different stakeholders, specifically risk rating agencies, also contribute to this international coordination. And with that, I'm closing. And once again, it's been my pleasure to discuss with all of you all these sections that we believe are important for Latin America in terms of fiscal policies. Thank you, Sebastian, and we're eager to see the results of the next Latin American economic outlook. Let's go on with the agenda now. Oscar Valencia, who's a leading specialist of the Fiscal Management Division at IDB. I believe you have a presentation. Yes, I do. Thank you, Daniel, once again for the invitation to share with you some analysis that we have done in the fiscal division and somehow summarizing what has been said. But in particular, I will focus on this question: public debt in the current context. It's a obstacle for economic growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. I believe that is one of the main questions that may come out of the debate that we've had today. And basically, this starts, let's think of before or pre-pandemic. As we've seen, growth in Latin America was quite poor. And when we look at it, total productivity of different factors, even a negative one. So the question is, growth sources that will allow us to be able to have sustainable rates to close gaps. That's a complex question. Now, in terms of fiscal issues, the economies in the region had gone through fiscal consolidation measured as reduction of primary balances very slowly, but had been done prior to COVID. But debt had been growing slowly with an increasing trend. And the question behind that is why primary balances or the fiscal effort that was done did not stabilize debt. Pandemic creeped in and the debt increased by more than 10 percentage points. And in that context of a new shock of supply and demand and more persistent demand shocks that may generate restrictions on economic growth. So I will start with a slide that seems quite innocent, but it does reflect the concern that we face. This is interest payment as a percentage of GDP, moderate, 2.4, 2.8, but with an increasing trend. In the second panel, we have expenditure in education, which should be an important growth source, decreasing while the other increased. If we compare the interest payment ratio to fiscal revenue, it's beyond or above 10%, which is a key indicator for risk rating agencies. So the account in order to pay for the credit card, it becomes more and more expensive. So access to debt has a significant opportunity cost in terms of growth sources. If we look at the debt service, which is amortization plus interest payment, today we pay 1.3 times more than what we spend on education and 80% of what we spend in healthcare. Now, in terms of how this sets in the current context, what we have seen is that although there has been a reduction of fiscal stimulus that comes from the pre-pandemic period, there's still stimulus that even is higher than the one we used to see in the international financial crisis for Latin America and the Caribbean. With the clash in terms of commodity prices and the increased subsidies for energy, countries have opted for adopting some measures. And very interestingly, these measures have focused on reductions in terms of tax reductions in 27% and 8% in expenditure measures, according to monetary fund indications. That means that the fiscal stimulus still there, and that will create fiscal pressures that are significant for the future. So what do we see in our calculations? Important pressures. So in terms of public spending, the estimate here is based on explicit subsidies, which is a response to marginal spending. So fiscally, for example, Brent price above 100, which means additional spending in terms of subsidies, which is expensive, and that could be 0.20. 0.5, 0.8, and in some countries these accounts are significant, which is a paradox, as they are even bigger on those countries that depend or rely on commodities, where we believe or we expect that there will be larger fiscal revenues. Fiscal revenues here have a significant connotation, although there will be fiscal revenues that will peak in this year. Most of the revenues will be next year, which will be 2.2, and those fiscal revenues are both tax and non-tax revenues, which is considered capital revenues from public enterprises. And the conclusion of all that is that this is not going to be paid by larger fiscal revenues because of the pressure coming from subsidies. This is a standard exercise of changes in the debt that we've seen in the last decade. What we see now is because of the effect of inflation, the debt was reduced to 1.7% on average in the last decade, whereas interest payment has been increased by 2.3% of the GDP, which means that the pressures created by interest payment may be even bigger than the ones that the effect of the debt is. And connecting this with the analysis that Santiago did, this is important because the interest payment creates budgetary flexibility that reduces space in terms of counter-cyclical fiscal policy management into the future. Now, thinking of the makeup or in terms of maturity, we see most of the debt is in the middle part. We have significant exposure in terms of foreign currency denominated debt, which even during the pandemic, that exposure increased due to the increased liquidity, but that makes it more susceptible to a valuation effect in terms of changing conditions in the market, such as exchange rate or sudden changes in financing conditions. And not only that, but from the point of view of creditors, we have a significant exposure to private creditors. And the debt, for example, domestic debt in the hands of foreigners, and maybe even above 20%, which also accounts a significant vulnerability. Now, so in terms of the domestic debt, those are the performance curves. A year ago, a month ago, and now in all of them, there's shifting. So the short part is increased, and the long tail of the curve is also increased. And the short end of the curve is because of the monetary policy reaction, but the long curve, and connected to several of the presentations here, possibly that effect, the inflationary effect, we will grow in terms of the long-term debt significantly. So the effect that inflation expectation could have a significant fiscal impact, which is key for our economies. Now, going back, our economies, although in terms of controlling inflation and in terms of the monetary policy, reacted last year, and they've been increasing not only the effect that this may have, but also the contraction of the balance sheet of the central banks. So basically, one of the important effects that we see in the global context is not only the increased rates in the US, but also the tightening that may affect the liquidity globally. So this also affects, or particularly affects, emerging economies, emerging countries in terms of their sovereign debt. What do we see in our analysis and forecasts? Supplementing what we saw in the first presentation we had done today. This is the effect on fiscal balance. We see that it's a gradual adjustment that does not reach the pre-COVID levels, in which is tightening of the financing conditions that may create pressures on debt levels. Now, in terms of the contrafactual analysis, we have a diagnosis that is somewhat shared with everybody else for what we have heard here of larger debt, but what happened otherwise if we're able to reduce the interest rate payments in 1 percentage points according to the historical evidence in our economies. Economic growth could increase by more than 1 percentage point, but we have significant effects on private investment of more than 4 percentage points, and even an impact on public investment. Although we may have negative actual interest rates, we shouldn't be expecting that the indebtedness levels could accommodate. But we need to think of a deleveraging process as soon as possible, because the impact on growth will suffer. Yet another exercise that we've done, in which if we consider the debt levels prior to COVID, 58% gross debt, we could have cumulative gains in the midterm in terms of economic growth per capita of 3.2 percentage points, which is a lot. Now, we can even lower this indebtedness level. There are two pieces of evidence that are key. First, we have the primary balance of the differential interest rate and actual growth rate. Why is it important to look at this? In order to achieve debt stability, even to reverse it, one needs for primary balance to grow faster than the interest rate differential compared to the growth rates. What have we seen in Latin America? That these differentials, although they are highly volatile, the primary balance does not react or will not react so quickly. In the bottom panel, what you see is an estimate of what Mendoza Stroid calls fiscal fatigue, which is the effort in terms of primary balance to try to counter these debt increases. And what we find is that Latin America indebtedness levels, the highest ones, mean that it is much more difficult to overcome the primary balance in order to stabilize debt. So the conclusion of this analysis is that we cannot be expecting to remain at a high debt level and to settle for a primary fiscal level that to be stabilized will be even more difficult, and increasing tax revenue will be more difficult from the point of view of economic feasibility. The other part has to do with public investment, and many of you have said it, the need to increase infrastructure spending or investment and improving the investment that is done. That chart is the efficient boundary of public investment to the public capital. And what we see here is that there are many things to be done in terms of efficiency of public investment. Although public investment in Latin America is not that high, there is a significant gap in terms of how it is spent efficiently and the impact that it could have on economic growth. Now, in terms of the challenges, if we look at it from the point of view of policy interest, we see important things. We are convinced that it is better to have fiscal rules than not having them. Fiscal balances historically, how have they been corrected in the countries that have had rules compared to those who have not had rules? They're more favorable during economic stresses, the possibility of generating a counter-cyclical policy because of the fiscal buffers that were created during the pandemic. Second, in the event of high-risk events, fiscal rules may be even efficient if they are implemented correctly. What does this mean? Usually, fiscal aggregates should reflect the movements in the changes in the stocks, the debt of stocks. So having fiscal aggregates that may have debt as an anchor are desirable because they also reduce the financing costs in the case of extreme events. Second, we also have empirical evidence that means that the fiscal debt reduces financing costs. In the case of some cases, the investment grade is achieved when they implement an efficient fiscal rule. They also reduce the probability of building not trust among investors. Now, in terms of macro fiscal institutions, it means that we need to integrate debt strategies with fiscal debt. That's why the debt anchors may even reconfigure the way in which the debt strategy is aligned with the macro fiscal scheduling, because not only debt managers absorb the risk minimization versus the cost, but also they absorb the macro fiscal decisions that may be adopted. Second, fiscal midterm fiscal frameworks in the region. There's a lot to be done yet in the region, basically in three areas. One is improving the fiscal forecasts. There are several studies that show that optimism ends up being fiscal realizations that are important when very optimistic forecasts and they do not adjust to a different situation. Fiscal frameworks in terms of thinking of the fiscal strategy, how to meet the strategy in terms of spending and revenues, and there needs to be a macro fiscal risk analysis that is concrete. So there are certain areas of intervention that are consistent with fiscal rules. And in the case of the pandemic, and going back to it is a golden opportunity because half of the countries have fiscal rules in the region. Most of them suspended those, but as we have seen, several of those countries are rethinking and recalibrating their fiscal schemes into the future and adapting to this new reality. So this is part of a strategy that is consistent with the midterm fiscal frameworks, and in a topic that will be discussed tomorrow in terms of strengthening the fiscal institutions, such as fiscal councils. We have seen that evidence that these fiscal councils help as a supplement as well to the fiscal policy decisions, especially by anchoring the fiscal expectations in parliaments in order to approve bills. With that, I'm closing. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Oscar, por esta interesante presentación.
The interpretation booth regrets to inform you that we have come to the end of our working day, and so we will now be cutting out until tomorrow. The meeting will continue a time longer, but only in Spanish. I do apologize. Thank you. Good evening.
Y Administración Tributaria de la OCDE a participar en este ilustre panel. El tema de esta sesión está alineado con los principios fundamentales del trabajo sobre la fiscalidad de la OCDE. Para nosotros, la política fiscal debe promover el crecimiento, mejorar la equidad y apoyar la sostenibilidad en igual medida. Para empezar con las políticas fiscales favorables al crecimiento, esos incluyen aquellas que estimulan la inversión en la investigación y desarrollo, enfocadas en las empresas jóvenes pequeñas y de baja productividad. Son también ellos que mejoran el diseño de los incentivos fiscales, pasando de los incentivos basados en los ingresos a los incentivos basados en los gastos. Refuerzan la participación en el mercado laboral mediante la ampliación de los créditos fiscales por ingresos laborales o de las correspondientes prestaciones laborales y garantizando que los trabajadores de mayor edad permanezcan activos en el mercado laboral. Promueven también créditos reembolsables para incentivar las inversiones en la formación y refuerzan la cooperación internacional para hacer frente a los retos de la digitalización y la evasión y elusión fiscal, aprovechando los avances del 2021 alrededor de la solución two-pillar. Al mismo tiempo, analizamos cómo puede la política fiscal combatir las crecientes desigualdades. Eso significa revisar los impuestos sobre las rentas del capital, de vivienda y de patrimonio de particulares. Significa también entender cómo y por qué los tipos impositivos efectivos varían a lo largo de la distribución de ingresos y del patrimonio. Significa eliminar los gastos fiscales regresivos y limitar las oportunidades de arbitraje, tanto nacionales como transfronterizas. Requiere una reforma fiscal que garantice un apoyo adecuado a los ingresos de los hogares más pobres. Implica que los sistemas fiscales den apoyo a la igualdad del género y deben reducir las diferencias en el tratamiento fiscal de los trabajadores estándar y no estándar. En tercer lugar, en materia de sostenibilidad, nos preguntamos cómo adecuar mejor los sistemas fiscales con los objetivos medioambientales. Por ejemplo, cómo adecuar los paquetes de políticas de mitigación, incluyendo la fijación de precios del carbono con los compromisos de cero neto. Cómo evitar también las fugas de carbono, por ejemplo, por potenciar el diálogo y la cooperación transfronteriza para limitar los efectos negativos sobre el comercio, el desarrollo y el crecimiento, e intensificar la acción global. Finalmente, ¿cómo hacer posible una transición justa? Vemos la importancia de las transferencias selectivas y medidas impositivas para apoyar a las personas y los trabajadores vulnerables. El secretario general de la OCDE anunció la semana pasada la creación de un nuevo foro inclusivo sobre la mitigación del carbono para solventar las carencias de datos y estudios con el fin de apoyar el diálogo entre los países. Si tomamos como ejemplo la transición justa, Europa en particular se enfrenta actualmente a las exigencias inherentes a este objetivo de forma dramática y acelerada. Mientras sus ciudadanos luchan contra el aumento del coste de los combustibles, muchos países han reducido el coste de la energía recortando los impuestos, renunciando así a dichos ingresos y cambiando también los incentivos de los ciudadanos, como lo mencionó Paulo. Creemos que el apoyo específico para ayudar a los hogares más afectados es una respuesta más eficaz, pero sabemos que eso tiene un costo para el gobierno que requiere sistemas de protección social relativamente bien desarrollados y que el nivel de ingresos es una de muchas variables que determina si un hogar necesita apoyo. Al mismo tiempo que los hogares sufren, las empresas energéticas obtienen importantes beneficios. El debate sobre un impuesto sobre los beneficios inesperados es intenso. Aunque estas medidas podrían ser razonables a corto plazo, dependiendo de las circunstancias específicas del país en cuestión, son difíciles de aplicar, entre otras cosas porque es difícil determinar qué constituye un nivel normal de beneficios. Cuanto más tiempo se mantengan estos impuestos, más complejas serán estas cuestiones. Hay tres áreas en las que estamos trabajando que me gustaría plantear aquí por ser muy relevantes para el debate actual. Primero, mejorar el funcionamiento del IVA. Ya hemos escuchado al equipo de estadísticas tributarias la importancia del IVA en la región. Todos somos conscientes de los complejos desafíos que existen entre la eficiencia y la equidad cuando se trata del IVA. Pero me gustaría centrarme aquí en los retos que la economía digital plantea a este impuesto. En colaboración con el Banco Mundial, el BID y el CIET, la OCDE elaboró el año pasado un conjunto de herramientas digitales para el IVA que ofrece una orientación completa y práctica para la reforma del IVA orientada al comercio digital. Se basa en los 4 pilares fundamentales del marco político de la OCDE para la aplicación del IVA al comercio digital. Esos son crear una base jurídica efectiva para el derecho a recaudar el IVA sobre las ventas electrónicas internacionales entrantes, jurisdicción sustantiva. Implementar un mecanismo de recaudación eficiente y eficaz. Aprovechar el poder de las plataformas digitales para mejorar la recaudación del IVA, exigiendo a los operadores de plataformas digitales que dominan el comercio digital mundial que recauden y remiten el IVA de las ventas realizadas a través de sus plataformas. Finalmente, facilitar y reforzar su cumplimiento mediante una gestión de riesgos y una cooperación administrativa moderna y basada en datos. Segunda prioridad es mejorar la fiscalidad del sector informal. Esto es una agenda en desarrollo para la OCDE y estamos estudiando en particular el potencial de los impuestos sobre la renta presuntiva. También somos conscientes de la importancia de ampliar la protección social en el sector informal como mecanismo clave para eliminar los vacíos en la cobertura de la protección social en toda la región. Tercer, impuestos y la cuestión de los impuestos y el género. Otra área en que estamos concentrando cada vez más es en torno a los impuestos a la equidad de género. Este año hemos publicado el primer análisis transnacional de los enfoques nacionales de la política fiscal y los resultados de equidad de género con el informe Tax Policy and Gender Equality. En el estudio se examina hasta qué punto los países tienen en cuenta la igualdad de género en la política y la administración tributaria, incluso mediante la elaboración de presupuestos con perspectiva de género o gender budgeting. También se examina cómo los países abordan los sesgos de género explícitos e implícitos en sus sistemas fiscales, así como la disponibilidad y el uso de datos desagregados por género, cruciales para la formulación de políticas con base empírica en esta área. En un segundo informe, examinamos la fiscalidad del trabajo a tiempo parcial, que tiene claras implicaciones para la igualdad de género, dado que hay 3 mujeres que trabajan a tiempo parcial por cada hombre que trabaja de esa forma en la OCDE. También las mujeres que trabajan a tiempo parcial ganan menos en casi todos los países que los hombres. Los impuestos progresivos reducen la brecha salarial entre los hombres y las mujeres, pero eso genera tipos impositivos marginales elevados que actúan como elemento disuasorio para que las mujeres trabajen más horas. Me gustaría concluir con otra exhortación que es más fácil de decir que de hacer. Los retos a los que se enfrentan los gobiernos pueden tener soluciones a corto plazo que entran en tensión con una visión a largo plazo para abordar los profundos retos sistémicos y estructurales actuales. Los gobiernos están sometidos a una gran presión para abordar retos sin precedente, ya que los países están saliendo de la pandemia, pero también se enfrentan a las repercusiones mundiales de la guerra en Ucrania, especialmente en los precios de la energía y los alimentos. También hay cierta preocupación por la sostenibilidad de las finanzas públicas, dado los elevados niveles de deuda pública en un contexto de subida de los tipos de interés. Al mismo tiempo, es necesario reflexionar a largo plazo sobre si nuestros sistemas fiscales están bien equipados para responder a los nuevos retos estructurales. Nuestras economías están experimentando cambios estructurales, cambios grandes, incluyendo, entre otros, la digitalización, el cambio climático y el envejecimiento de la población. Y nuestros sistemas fiscales deben seguir siendo adecuados para este entorno cambiante. La adaptación de los sistemas fiscales al futuro será fundamental para garantizar la sostenibilidad de las finanzas públicas, pero también para asegurar que los sistemas fiscales sigan desempeñando su papel en la promoción de un crecimiento sostenible e inclusivo. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Alex, por esta interesante intervención y muchas gracias también por hablar en español. Apreciamos el gesto. Y nos queda Carlos Cantú para su presentación. ¿Tienes el control para la presentación? Aprovecho para hacer la presentación. Carlos Cantú es economista del Banco de Pagos Internacionales y nos hablará sobre las interacciones entre política fiscal y monetaria en países de la región, como comenté al inicio de la sesión, para complementar los temas fiscales que hemos abordado. Carlos, adelante. Listo, muchas gracias. Nada más espero que pongan la presentación. Y bueno, agradezco la invitación por presentar en este foro. Ha sido muy interesante. Ya sé que yo soy el último, lo único que está entre ustedes y la cena, pero trataré de ser lo más breve con mis 34 diapositivas. Son solamente 4. Bueno, como dije, muchas gracias por la invitación. Primero, un disclaimer. Los puntos de vista que voy a presentar son solo míos y no representan necesariamente los del Banco de Pagos Internacionales. Creo que toda la sesión se ha hablado mucho sobre política fiscal, un poco sobre política monetaria, pero no tanto sobre cómo interactuar entre ellas, ¿no? Los canales interconectados entre la política fiscal y monetaria son en realidad un reto para aquellas personas que toman las decisiones de política. En particular porque los diseños de la autoridad fiscal y el Banco Central se implementan y se deciden de forma independiente, ¿no? Cada uno decide su propia política de manera independiente, pero tomar decisiones sin tomar en consideración lo que el otro está tomando en cuenta puede llevar a que estas políticas batallen entre ellas. Por ejemplo, en un documento que acaba de salir de trabajo con Ana Aguilar y Claudia Ramírez Bulos, mostramos que cuando la política fiscal y monetaria trabajan juntas, entonces la respuesta de política monetaria no tiene que ser tan agresiva. Entonces, por ejemplo, si vemos estos dos gráficos, lo que estamos comparando es la respuesta, bueno, las condiciones económicas y la respuesta de política durante la crisis del COVID, que es en azul, y durante la recuperación. Entonces, durante la crisis del COVID, lo que podemos ver es que las condiciones económicas exactamente propiciaban que hubiera una respuesta agresiva de política tanto fiscal y monetaria. Y estas respuestas se
se complementaron la una a la otra. Por ejemplo, las facilidades que se le dieron a los bancos comerciales sustentadas por los créditos de los gobiernos ayudaron a que no hubiera una restricción financiera tan grande. Y en cambio, las compras de los activos por medio de los bancos centrales ayudaron a que no hubiera tantos disturbios en la parte larga de la curva, lo cual ayudó a la expansión fiscal. Sin embargo, ahora en la parte de la recuperación, vemos que la política fiscal y monetaria ya no están sincronizadas. Los bancos centrales han aumentado las tasas de interés a niveles no vistos desde antes de la crisis financiera, y en contraste, la política fiscal, aunque ya ha habido una consolidación importante, todavía podemos ver que los déficits fiscales para 2022 siguen siendo positivos. El reto es todavía más grande debido a que el punto de inicio de los mercados emergentes es un poco más complicado que el pasado. A pesar de que han estado disminuyendo la fracción de deuda que tienen en moneda extranjera y que la cuenta corriente está más, los déficits de cuenta corriente son más pequeños, ahora están enfrentando condiciones financieras más difíciles, con deuda más alta que aumentó debido a la pandemia. Entonces, ¿cómo están interactuando la política fiscal y monetaria en este entorno? Y cómo las decisiones de uno afectan la otra. Bueno, esta gráfica creo que la hemos visto fácil 6 veces en estas sesiones, y es porque es impresionante cómo la inflación se ha disparado, ¿no? La inflación general se disparó considerablemente si empezamos desde enero del 2022, y de hecho digo, la inflación es rampante, ¿no? O sea, no se esperaba que explotara de esta manera, y esto ha ido afectando las expectativas de inflación, las cuales se han ido poco a poco desanclando, lo cual es muy preocupante para los bancos centrales. Si vemos en la gráfica del medio, o sea, la barra verde es exactamente el cambio en las expectativas de inflación de enero a la fecha. Entonces, en algunos casos es alrededor del 4%. En respuesta, claramente los bancos centrales han estado aumentando la tasa de política monetaria. En algunos países, por ejemplo, en Brasil ha aumentado más del 10%, y para el cierre del 2022 pues se sigue esperando aumentos considerables. Estas gráficas nada más consideran los países que son inflation targets, ¿no? de la región. Y el panorama fiscal ejerce presiones inflacionarias, ¿no? Por ejemplo, sabemos que la deuda está en niveles históricos y niveles máximos históricos casi. Y los déficits fiscales continúan siendo positivos para 2022. Entonces, estos déficits fiscales continuamente positivos van a hacer más difícil el trabajo para los bancos centrales para bajar la inflación a sus objetivos, al menos por 2 razones. En primer lugar, los déficits fiscales ejercen una presión sobre la demanda agregada, lo cual hace que aumente la inflación, y esto es sobre todo un efecto mayor sobre las economías que tienen una brecha de inflación, una brecha de producto que ya está casi cerrada o en algunos casos positiva. El otro mecanismo es a través de la percepción de los mercados financieros acerca de la sustentabilidad de la deuda. Por ejemplo, otro documento que fue preparado por nuestro gerente de las economías de América Latina y el Caribe y otros autores, muestra que cuando la proporción de la deuda pública en moneda extranjera es alta, entonces un aumento en los déficits fiscales genera una depreciación de la moneda. Entonces, esta depreciación es una de las razones por las cuales los déficits en general lo que hacen es mover la distribución de las inflaciones futuras, y eso aumenta los riesgos a que haya nada más alta inflación, y la mayor inflación hace que haya un desanclaje de las expectativas de inflación. Además, cuando este impacto de los déficits sobre la inflación también es mayor cuando los niveles de la deuda son grandes. Y otro problema es que no va a ser tan fácil disminuir estos déficits, ¿no? Acortar el déficit fiscal. En primer lugar, algunos de estos aumentos en el gasto pueden ser que sean más difíciles de revertir, especialmente en aquellas economías que por el momento tienen problemas políticos. Además, también los impuestos pueden ser difíciles de aumentar o o reformar debido a, como hemos observado últimamente, por el desequilibrio, los problemas sociales o las manifestaciones sociales que se pueden dar cuando se anuncian este tipo de políticas, como por ejemplo el caso de la reforma fiscal en Colombia. Si vemos en la última gráfica, los déficits, el balance fiscal ajustado por el ciclo, todavía para 2022 sigue siendo positivo, que sería la barra verde, con excepción de México. Y esto sigue siendo considerado como si fuera una política fiscal que es todavía expansiva, bueno, acomodaticia. ¿Cuáles son los factores entonces otros factores que pueden también estar en juego? Bueno, para 2022 hemos visto una salida de capital de la región. Otra vez la sustentabilidad de las posiciones fiscales pueden llevar a que aumente esta salida de capitales de la región, lo cual puede llevar a una depreciación de la moneda y además a condiciones financieras que sean menos propicias para la inversión. Entonces, esta presión sobre el tipo de cambio podría aumentar la inflación todavía más. En segundo lugar está el crecimiento. En la mayoría de los países, el crecimiento se espera que aterrice a niveles todavía menores que antes de la pandemia y en los próximos años. Esto, sobre todo en América Latina, se espera que todo este crecimiento sea aún menor. Estos problemas con el crecimiento pueden llevar a que la autoridad fiscal entonces no ajuste tan fácil el presupuesto y continúe con una posición expansiva. Finalmente, para los bancos centrales va a ser difícil continuar el aumento de las tasas de interés si las condiciones financieras globales continúan siendo apretadas y además si el costo de financiamiento sigue aumentando. Entonces, como podemos ver en la última gráfica, lo tenemos ahí, es el riesgo soberano y además un índice de las condiciones financieras internacionales que, como podemos ver, está todavía más arriba que a principios de la pandemia. Entonces, el aumento en las primas de riesgo puede disminuir la confianza de los inversionistas sobre los gobiernos y además disminuir su acceso a los mercados de fondos internacionales. Entonces, esta imagen lo que nos muestra es en realidad cuál es la tensión entre política fiscal y monetaria mientras se está tratando de llegar a un proceso de normalización. Sobre todo, esto puede ejercer presión sobre los bancos centrales para que mantengan una posición de política monetaria que sea más acomodaticia que la que en realidad se necesita para llevar a controlar la inflación y mantener las expectativas de inflación ancladas al objetivo. Por ejemplo, en otro documento de nuestro gerente de América Latina muestra que en periodos en los cuales podemos hablar sobre dominancia fiscal, la inflación siempre tiene que tender a ser más alta que en otros periodos. Asimismo, yo también tengo otro documento en el cual mostramos que durante periodos de dominancia fiscal, la respuesta, por ejemplo, de la política monetaria puede generar un efecto contrario sobre el tipo de cambio. Entonces, en vez de que un aumento en la tasa de interés genere una apreciación del tipo de cambio, debido a la dominancia fiscal y a la pérdida de confianza de los inversionistas, lo que podemos observar es una depreciación del tipo de cambio, lo cual llevaría todavía a mayor inflación. Entonces, el riesgo de entrar en periodos de dominancia fiscal otorga una prima a los arreglos institucionales que salvaguardan la independencia de los bancos centrales, que enfatiza la primicia de inflación baja y estable como la base de los objetivos de política monetaria. La independencia del Banco Central es de alto valor, pero no existe en vacío. Requiere también una política fiscal robusta. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias por tu intervención. Y bueno, con esto damos por concluida la sesión número 3. Quisiera agradecer el tiempo y la disposición de todos y una vez más estamos muy agradecidos con que nos estén visitando. Esperamos que podamos seguir teniendo el seminario de manera presencial hacia el futuro. Daniel.
Gracias, no, simplemente agradecerles a todos su participación hoy día. Después de 2 años de que esto no era presencial, no podían esperar menos que una larga jornada sin parar, digamos, del primer día de reencuentro presencial. Esperemos que mañana, ya después de este shock de emoción, el día sea más suave. Así que no, muchas gracias a todos. Ahora nos espera un pequeño cóctel como para soltar la la discusión del día y seguir discutiendo los que quieran, espero que sobre otra dominancia y no la fiscal. Así que muchas gracias a todos y los invito al cóctel.
Muchas gracias y nada más recordarles, mañana arrancamos a las 8:45 de la mañana.